See, I've seen a lot of death in the last few years, Wally, and there's one thing that's for sure about death. You do it alone, you see. That seems quite certain, you see. That I've seen. That the people around your bed mean nothing. Your reviews mean nothing. Whatever it is, you do it alone. And so the question is, when I get on my deathbed, what kind of a person am I going to be?
Throughout history, we have always feared the Reaper. Death is the scariest thing we'll ever do, and there's no way to prepare for the other side. By naming death, we as humans can give this dark uncertainty a grim face. Hi, I'm gonna die, but at least I'll make some friends while I'm at it. From the dawn of man, people have always sought to understand the unknowable parts of life. We tell each other stories to fill in the gaps, we make heroes to sing our virtues, and we make monsters to rally against. And, if there was ever a monster to rally against, it's death itself. While we know him as the Grim Reaper, he's been lurking around the corner since we first woke up in Plato's cave. No matter what language you speak, where you were born, or how you lived, we all know that one day it'll all go away. Death takes from us. Even if you're the absolute governor and aren't afraid of death for yourself, you're likely still afraid of it for others. When we die, we leave those we love behind. When our loved ones die, it can feel like we're being left behind ourselves. We have to go on living with this hole next to us. A hole dug by, well, we don't really know. That is, we didn't know until we gave it a name. Taking a step back though, we need to define a very important term before we go any further. A psychopomp is a spiritual guide to the afterlife. While many cultures and religions have their own gods of the afterlife or of the underworld, some have bespoke entities specifically for this purpose. Gods will often serve as psychopomps, but some cultures give that job to specific individuals. These beings have no control over the domain of the dead intrinsically. Their job is to harvest the souls of the dead and bring them to their ultimate fate. Today, we'll be taking a look at some of the forms and depictions of history's greatest villain. Before we start though, as this is a video concerning religion on the internet, we need to set a pretty firm scope here. First, I want to tepidly ground us in secularity. I won't get into my own personal religious beliefs right now. That will be saved for much later when I do get into my own religious beliefs. I do, however, want to make sure we take a tonally consistent approach to this discussion, especially when looking at both ancient and modern religions. It's not hard to guess that while some myths around psychopomps, especially the Grim Reaper, have been very heavily secularized, most of the forms these spirits will take in this discussion have very significant and sacred theological origins. While I have done my best to understand the roots of these beliefs, I am by no means an expert on any of these subjects, and I would like to disclaim any future inaccuracies up front. This project intends to view and compare these stories across cultures from the perspective of those who knew and told the stories at the time. We'll be exploring these ideas from that perspective. This isn't to say that there isn't some incredibly profound wisdom in these... Sorry, the sun just gave me a seizure. This isn't to say that there's not some incredibly profound wisdom in some of these ideas. I'm only clarifying that we will be aiming for objectivity regarding these belief systems. Instead of trying to proclaim any of these as a religious truth, our goal will be to look at how cultures have fit these psychopomp figures into their mythos and belief systems, and how these views have changed over time. Speaking of mythos, we're going to use the term myth, mythos, and mythology to describe the beliefs of both ancient and modern religions here. I don't use these terms to discount the legitimacy of these beliefs or traditions, but rather in the literal sense of the term mythos. These are beliefs specific to individual cultures, religions, and time periods, and it wouldn't be academically honest to refer to the practices of our ancient counterparts as any more or less legitimate than those among us today. In other words, no individual topic is going to be treated with any more or less reverence or respect than any other. Second, this isn't really an exploration of the afterlife itself. That may seem counterintuitive, but we're really only looking at that middle period between death and the afterlife. There will undoubtedly be times when it's impossible not to discuss a certain culture's idea of the afterlife, but it's not the focus of this video, and we won't go out of our way to discuss it in any detail, except when absolutely necessary. In short, we're here for the journey, but not the destination. Third, I don't have any great way to say it, but this is probably going to be a boring one. I don't think I'm obligated to justify my own content to you, but I do want to be courteous of your time and give you an idea of where your time investment is going here. In the following sections, we're going to break down a few examples of death personified across a handful of cultures and track the lineage of how these ancient beliefs have carried over to our modern interpretations of the Reaper. While we go through our examples, we will be building our own understanding of how our relationship with death has changed over time and what our current understanding says about the wider scope of culture today. We'll then wrap up with some closing thoughts and be on our way, hopefully not giving anyone a complex or starting any panic attacks. That being said, we are going to spend the rest of the video talking about death and dying in very blunt terms. While I'm not trying to intentionally say anything too gnarly, if this is a sensitive topic for you, I don't really have any other advice for you other than maybe you just want to skip this one. Alright, I'm done preambling and we're ready for the main amble. Now, we're going to take a sort of roundabout path through time here, but I have a feeling that the path laid out ahead of us will take us on a smooth and easy to digest journey. Our sails are set and the skies look clear as we're setting down on the River Styx. I think it makes sense to start with the origins of the Grim Reaper as an idea. We're going to get into some of the more ancient examples later, but I feel like it makes sense to start with what we all know and use that as a baseline for comparison. The modern-day Reaper can be traced back to 14th century England and was brought about mostly due to this crazy fad called the Black Death. The bubonic plague in Europe literally decimated the population, killing more than 75 million in the mid to late 1300s. For those living through it at the time, the effects of the plague were inescapable. Even outside of the staggering infection rates, the symptoms of the disease itself were highly visible, with distended lymph nodes and sores leading to a sharp fever. The key early symptoms of the plague are delirium and vomiting. Even if you yourself were able to avoid falling ill and somehow stayed away from those who had been infected, which was very difficult to do in cities where it flourished, the effects on society were even more unavoidable. The huge crash in the working population led to shortages, economic hardship, civil unrest, and could have led to total societal collapse in the region had a few dice of fate been tossed differently. With all this came a certain tone for the arts at the time. Death was all around you, so as an artist, death often became your muse. Even as early as 1200, we see our first depiction of death as a skeletal figure in this fresco from St. Cadoc's Church in Wales. This sort of memento mori, or a reminder of death, became incredibly commonplace in the region. While some of these works were subtle with general imagery evocative of death, many were very explicit in their meaning. Looking at this example, we see three noble women looking across the page at three decaying corpses. Some of the women look at the grim troop, but one looks away. The leftmost corpse is infested with insects, indicating the insidious decay caused by the disease. It could also be linked to the main vector that the plague took, which was infected fleas coming from the street animals like rats and dogs. The center corpse is clothed and covering itself in shame, mimicking the middle noblewoman on the other side of the page. Neither of them is looking at their counterpart. This could be the living one horrified by the fate that awaits them, and the dead one ashamed of the state that they're in. The last skeleton is not mimicking its living counterpart, but instead blankly stares outwards towards the viewer. This corpse is unclothed with an open stomach cavity, as if welcoming you to the vast emptiness and nothingness of death. Western audiences tend to work their way from left to right when looking at something because of how our system of writing works. That in mind, this last skeleton is likely the last thing a viewer will see in this painting, leaving them with that feeling of emptiness, and the staring face of the skeleton last in their mind as they walk away. In Plague-era Europe, the Catholic Church was omnipresent in one's everyday life, and these paintings served as reminders of one's potentially imminent death and the perdition awaiting you should you lead a life of sin. It's no coincidence that so many of the living depicted in these paintings are shown as nobility. They were meant to tamp down on excess and scare people into living a virtuous life in accordance with the church. At the time, this was a benefit for the church both in a spiritual regard and logistically, as religious organizations were often the front line of defense for treatment and stopping the spread of the disease. We often think of the church as strictly a religious leader, as they exist nowadays, but back during the plague, the church was your religion, your community center, your local government, and your primary source of health care. Its presence in people's everyday lives cannot be overstated, so the direction that it decided to take its art patronage was absolutely influential on those in their audience. It also just so happened that the intended audience naturally loved the paintings. According to a paper by Paul Binsky, the post-plague art world took a shift towards the absurd and surreal. As there was greater social mobility due to the deaths of many in the established ruling class, the wave of new money art patrons played a heavy role in the evolution of popular styles. To give an example of this post-plague surrealism, this painting by Hans Holbein the Younger presents two statesmen in a traditional style portrait. The surreal element comes from the heavily distorted image of a skull that sits at the bottom of the painting. The intent was that when looked at from the right angle, the skull would become less distorted and more defined, showing how, even when it's not obvious, death is always one step away. This type of symbolism highlighted for those in the era how even with the plague winding down, death was still right under you, waiting just out of sight. This idea of the skeleton is where the original form of the Reaper comes from. In our 3 living, 3 dead pieces, we're already seeing similarities to our Reaper with their tattered robes and fleshless frames. We can also draw parallels to Christian scripture for the spirit of death in the book of Revelations. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Here, the imagery of the pale horse, paired with the other horsemen of famine, pestilence, and war, gives the reader an idea of weariness and starvation. The pale horse evokes images of sickly skin from illness, and the weathered condition the plague could leave many victims in as they perish. Even so, the idea of the spirit of death is still fairly prevalent in Abrahamic traditions, even outside of Revelations. In Christianity, we see the angel of death on several occasions. We have our previous example during Judgment Day, where he comes to kill endlessly at the end of days. We also see the angel of death in the book of Exodus with the story of Moses. When the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, Moses promised 10 plagues on the people of Egypt, the last of which was the angel of death coming down to kill the firstborn children of all the unfaithful. God's instructions to Moses and his people were to smear lamb's blood on their thresholds, to instruct the angel of death to spare their family from this punishment. This shows the horrifying reach the spirit of death has in him and the power of God to command such a spirit. Unfortunately, though, while we see death a lot in the Bible, it's fairly mum on the subject when it comes to personifying him and letting us in on his thoughts or wants. The biblical incidents of death show him more as a general concept and as a tool to be used by God when necessary to fight the enemies of his people than as an individual with personality. The Bible's mentions of the afterlife are mostly focused on the actual destination and don't dwell on the interim too much. I'll be careful not to fall down the biblical fan fiction rabbit hole, but both Dante and John Milton make notable mentions of death in their respective epic poems. Specifically for our case, Book 2 of John Milton's Paradise Lost has death appear briefly as one of the gatekeepers of hell alongside the spirit of sin, who's his mom, I think? I'm honestly not really sure. Milton intended to write Paradise Lost in the style of Homer, which to a Zoomer means he intentionally made it really hard to read and understand for clout. This is true for most of the Abrahamic religions, except for, you know what? Why don't you put a pin in Islam for now? We'll come back to it later. Instead, since we're on the ancient train, we can do some lightning round picks. I got cold. In ancient Greece, the god Charon was the famous angry ferryman on the river Styx. He'll row you along for the price of 2 obols, but will make you walk the shores of the river for 100 years if not. Our first record of him from mythology is from, we see him heavily featured also in, he's very old. His story is incredibly well known though, so I guess we'll just have to take their word for it on this one. This is a YouTube video, I don't need to have any citable information in here. We also have the god Anubis in ancient Egypt. A terrifying figure with the head of a jackal and the body of a warrior. He's known for judging mortals on their sins and weighing their hearts on a scale against a measly feather before condemning them to oblivion. He's such a good example of a psychopomp that he's usually the first example that pops up after the Reaper himself when you Google the term psychopomp. Google would never give you any incorrect information on this stuff. His story is recorded in period, and he was worshipped starting in the... If we just ignore it, maybe it'll go away. We just gotta keep moving. Short video, short video, short video. Next up is the fearsome god Yama. Dark blue skin, snarling teeth, devil horns, and riding an ox. This guy is absolutely terrifying. Even the AI summary is scared of him, and that's never wrong. I mean, if it weren't reliable, why would they make it the first thing that shows up anytime you search something? We can see in the... this actually says something completely different. Oh well, it's probably just a mistranslation or something. I mean, what's a rigged Vita anyway, right? I'm sure his story is absolutely horrifying in the Hindu Bible. That's a thing, right? Right? Thanks for meeting me here. I would have picked somewhere nicer, but I didn't want us to be followed. I may have left a few things out. Let me explain. You see, I had a pretty clear idea of what this video was going to be when I went into it. This was a shorter topic that I could hopefully crack out in half the time as my last one and a third shorter than my next one. The idea was simple. The Grim Reaper used to be scary, but now he's not. What's up with that? Well, in the early stages of research for this, I started realizing that death used to be personified in very neutral or nuanced ways with figures like Anubis and Charon, and it was the plague itself that really first changed the story for the negative. And then I started digging into these guys a little bit deeper, and, well, let me show you. Yeah, I spent the last few months looking into these guys, and let me tell you, their stories just don't add up. At first, I thought I was just going crazy, but now, I think we're all getting bamboozled. For example, let's take a look at Mr. Ferryman here. Old man on the river Styx. Happy to give you a ride for a few obols. Give him his fare and he'll play nice. Try and cheat him though. You'll be walking the shores of the river for 100 years. It's a classic part of Greek mythology, right? Well, I went digging. Our guy, our shining, easy example for an essay about psychopomps, he's a ghost in the record. Absolutely no mention of him in the majority of the Greek theological record. Let's start from the beginning, though. This here is an excerpt from the poem Minyas. We only have fragments of it, but it appears to be from about 500 BCE. It was recorded by the great poet Pausanias, but we don't really know who wrote it originally. Pausanias was just recording and compiling orally shared stories and poems from the Minian region. I too have shared orally, but I'm not going to write a friggin' poem about it. The poem is about the old king Pythoreus and the hero Theseus delving deep into the underworld. Among the recovered fragments of the poem, we have this one line. There they did not find the boat that the dead board, which the old ferryman Charon guided at its birth. This is the first and absolute oldest mention of him that anyone can find. And it's from the motherfucking 6th century BC. Over 200 years after the epic works of Homer, which cover the afterlife in great detail, including every god and creature one would come across in the... I have to stay calm or else it'll come back. Even after this brief mention in an obscure poem, we don't really see him anywhere for another few hundred years. The artist Polygnotus, one of the famous painters of the Pantheon, featured him in a few renditions of the gods, but even our man Pausanias specifically called out in his notes that Polygnotus was likely just going off that one line from Minyas and not from any external talk of this riverman. That's a pretty weird thing to call out if this were a well-known god at the time. Polygnotus in particular is worth identifying as a questionable character. His most relevant contribution to the story seems to be his depiction of Charon as a weathered, ornery old man, a key character trait that seems to have originated from him. In fact, the series that he did on the Pantheon where Charon is featured is where a lot of new additions to the Greek canon come from, such as the demon Euronymous, a devil who stalks the underworld and eats the meat off of abandoned corpses. There's literally zero record anywhere of Euronymous before these paintings, so there's a good chance that he just flat out made that one up. And that's more or less how it went for Charon. Brief, fleeting mentions of him here and there, by liars, but nothing of substance written down. Well, at least not until the war. The Peloponnesian War was a civil war between the Athenian Greeks and the Spartans in the late 5th century BCE. Relationships between Sparta and Athens had been tense for ages, so tense that they had already fought a Peloponnesian War a few decades before, but it didn't satisfy either of them. There are a lot of things you could point to for the cause of the war, but the main drivers came from the Reconstruction period after the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greco-Persian Wars were a series of conflicts that led to the fall of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Greeks as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Without going into much deeper of a rabbit hole, the important takeaway is that the Persian War left Athens as an insanely powerful state in the region. After the war, Sparta demanded that Athens not rebuild the walls that connected them to the port city of Piraeus, which were destroyed as a part of the conflict. These walls stood as Athens' main defense against Sparta, leaving them nearly invulnerable to a land-based attack, so Sparta felt incredibly threatened and targeted. They warned Athens that rebuilding these defenses would be seen as an act of hostility and would provoke military action from Sparta and her allies. Athens proceeded to completely ignore them and rebuilt the walls anyway. The spring-loaded maps are too expensive and the joke wasn't that funny. It's important to note that while their respective allies were fairly evenly matched, Athens and Sparta each had strategic advantages over the other in certain regards. Specifically, Sparta's land-based soldiers were unmatched in training, weaponry, and numbers, whereas Athens' navy was believed to be unbeatable, especially when compared to Sparta. The Athenian League had an incredibly dominant lead in the first few phases of the war, being the clear choice winner between the two sides. However, where's Sicily? A devastating loss in Sicily to the Spartan coalition, led by Syracuse's navy, Go Big O, started a gradual turn for the worse in Athens. Shortly after the loss in Sicily, Sparta gained more and more ground on Athens until eventually breaching the walls of the city and marking a decisive end to the conflict, with the Spartans as the victors. Sparta would rebuild and continue to rule over Athens for a while until it was taken over again by the city of Thebes, a former ally of Sparta, which ruled for a few more years until Macedon took it over for a little while before it was taken over once more for good measure when Alexander the Great unified Greece into a single empire. Okay, pause. What just happened here? What does any of this have to do with Charon? A recurring theme we're about to see here is that there's no straight answers for any of this, and we can't assume anything we read is true unless it's been written in stone and smashed into a million pieces. The research phase of this project took many turns and tangents that will likely reflect in the points we bring up throughout the discussion. When you try to understand the evolution of a culture over the course of hundreds, or as we'll later see, potentially thousands of years, you'll either need to make some pretty heavy assumptions and concessions, or be prepared to unload a shit ton of context. But moving on, how does this fit in with our topic today? Well, as you can imagine, life for the Athenian Greeks was pretty tough during this period. Even before the war hit their front steps, the Athenian League had to push hard to get their numbers up to match Sparta's armies. Because of this, conscription numbers went up, supplies ran low, and moods soured. There are several recorded incidents of civil unrest in Athens during this time, and even into the brief period of Spartan rule. This unrest made its way into the media of the day, including plays, poems, and books. People used stories to voice their discontent with the Athenian ruling class, and as the Greeks did best, they used their pantheon as puppets for satire. Starting during the war, we start seeing Charon pop up all over the place in plays. It's not definitive, but with so much of his presence being comedic relief and satire, I strongly believe that this new popularity was directly influenced by the struggles of wartime. One example we see from this period is the play The Frogs from the playwright Aristophanes, where we see Dionysus venturing down into hell. In preparation for this, he's speaking to the hero Heracles, who instructs Dionysus to bring 2 obols for Charon. Dionysus asks him why he needs 2, and he says that the price had gone up because of the war. This is emblematic of what I was just talking about. So, that's clearly a joke. It's probably in reference to the cost of plays in the area rising by about that much due to the war. Jokes and satire are fine, but they're not exactly helpful when it comes to trying to figure out what people actually thought in the period. We can use context and extrapolate from there and say, well, if the joke is that the price went up, then it must have previously been 1 obol as a fare. Although, to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing flat out saying this to be the case. I'm doing a lot of extrapolating here to give you guys a better story, but it totally makes sense how a lot of this nuance gets lost over time, and how our modern understanding of him as one of the main players in the pantheon could manifest, even though, to the best I can tell, he didn't really exist in any meaningful way until near the end of the Greek Empire. So I guess, what's the takeaway here? What makes Charon worth remembering now, and what can both versions of his story teach us? Well, I think for the first question, for me, Charon is an interesting figure primarily because this is a story tying material wealth to success in the afterlife. I think the obvious interpretation of this is the effect that rapid development had on Greek society. A sprawling empire that spanned from the Bronze Age all the way into the Classical era would have seen a lot of change in culture as various agrarian indigenous cultures in the Aegean and Mediterranean regions transitioned into a monolithic, goods-based system of capital. Without digging out the ghost of my boy Carl, it's very interesting to consider how tying the output of one's labor to success in the afterlife can be used as a justification for the effort put into one's work. Writing it out further, we could potentially even see this as a way for the upper class to get their employees to work longer and harder. Depending on your profession, 2 obols could have been a lot, and you gotta make sure you have them ready if you ever kick the bucket unexpectedly. We're gonna see in just a few moments here that a happy, successful, and even safe experience after death isn't always a given. In all the religions and beliefs I've looked at, the concept of earthly wealth playing into your safety in the afterlife is somewhat unique to the Greeks. Many cultures buried the dead with their possessions or with trinkets to make them more comfortable in the afterlife, but in the case of the Greeks, if you leave Charon hanging, you're marooned on the shores of the river Styx for 100 years in misery before you get dropped off with Cerberus. Under this model, the average worker can give more spiritual meaning to how they spend most of their life. This can be viewed in contrast to the more contemporary spiritual beliefs, which tend to skew more negatively towards extreme focus on one's career or economic success. The modern view of you can't take it with you is flipped on its head to more closely align with you'll sleep when you're dead. It's also an interesting parallel to modern Christian prosperity gospel practices. I won't get too into it, but many of the same principles here can apply directly to this new religious niche. As for the second part of the question about the importance of Charon's context, well, I think it serves as a great example for how these shifts happen over time. Charon was a nobody, a minor character that a random painter chose as his pantheon donut steel OC god. Once we could fit him into the narrative, once we could use him to tell a story, that's when he came in. The context shows him as less of a stoic and surly companion to carry you down the river, but more of a manifestation of this massive war that devastated much of the region. Being death adjacent becomes the least interesting part about him. But overall, what are my thoughts on Charon as a psychopomp? That's what I'm doing, right? I guess I'm like ranking them or something. I don't know. We're not even close to done, and I already lost the plot here. I think, ultimately, I like Charon. It's hard for me to separate him from the modern pop culture interpretations of him, but I think he served a good purpose for what he was. If people really did believe he was rowing with the big dogs in Greek myth, then I think you could do worse than having someone who's basically just my dad row you down the river. If he really was just a piece of satire in the post-war haze, then I guess, well played. That's pretty much it for Charon. I initially picked him out as the easiest example, but as you saw, there's a ton of baggage that comes with him that needs to be unloaded before we can have a conversation. Hi, editing Colin from the future here. I just found out that Thanatos exists, who is another Greek god of death. This complicates things. I don't think it really matters because he's comparable to Hades in that he's not a psychopomp in any real capacity. He's more just another god of death and a minor one at that. But I do think it's worth bringing up that he does exist and he is referenced all over the place in all of Homer's works and all the other primary sources we have on Greek mythology. Thanatos is a known regular player, but I don't think he's all that relevant. I just wanted to get ahead of the actually comments saying that I forgot about this other guy. I also know Hermes exists, but I don't care. But I won't dwell on it any longer than I have to. No, instead I think we should look at someone a little bit more nefarious. Anubis is the jackal-headed god of ancient Egypt, who presides over the purification and mummification of the body and is well known for his role as a psychopomp. At the time of death, he leads the Ba, the aspect of a person that is activated in non-ordinary states, such as sleep and death, to the entrance to the underworld, where the Ba undergoes its own purifying journey. After this, Anubis reunites the person's Ba with their core self and leads the deceased to the Hall of Maat, where the scales of judgment weigh the heart against a feather. When the scales tip in favor of the deceased, they are granted immortality and access to the Egyptian afterlife. Or at least that's his side of the story. What I just read is an excerpt from Psychopomps.org, where Anubis is the second example they give in their guide to psychopomps. When I started the research phase of this project, Psychopomps.org was one of the first resources I found that cataloged this stuff. I was excited to see another person with this line of interest, and I thought it would be an incredibly useful starting point for my research. After I started digging deeper, though, folks, it's time we talked about quackery. Not only is this site mostly wrong about everything I read, parts of it are so incorrect that I'm starting to wonder if this whole thing is some sort of Fed psyop or misinformation campaign, like someone out there actually figured out what the afterlife is like, so they had to put a bunch of bullshit out there to throw us off the trail. If you intend on starting your own journey into the world of psychopomps, I would advise you stay away from places like this blog, as it will largely lead to confusion down the road. For now, though, just keep in mind that on the literal website advertising the most common and popular psychopomps, Anubis is the literal second example they give. So if we're not taking any of that as valid information, though, let's fill in the blanks here. To start, let's cover the things that the blog got right. Anubis was the Egyptian god of death and embalming. They were sort of right that he was worshipped in ancient Egypt, but they weren't very specific on the time window. He was worshipped starting at the end of the pre-dynastic period. In terms of his role in the embalming process, he was worshipped and referred to all the way up through the Roman takeover, where his mythology was merged with the Greek god formerly known as Hermes before he rebranded and started calling himself Mercury. As for his role as Psychopomp in Lord of the Underworld, we'll get to that. He is often depicted as a man with the head of a jackal and is instrumental in the process of embalming and burial. Much like other Egyptian gods, though, he's often represented as a full jackal. All that is true. So now, what's going on here? Well, after following this guy's trail for several months and achieving the equivalent of an associate's degree in Egyptian mortuary practices, I don't think Anubis can even really be called a psychopomp. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. What is supported by evidence here? What did these people actually believe? Well, I think it's best to run through chronologically what happens after you die in the Egyptian tradition, from the moment of death up through the ever after. First of all, if you're broke, this whole conversation is a non-starter. Poor people did bury their dead, and some even tried to embalm them, but the structures weren't permanent, and the academic knowledge of embalming was not super accessible to the average person. The Egyptian focus on entombment and embalming has less to do with preserving the body and keeping it fresh and secure in this world, and has a lot more to do with preparation for the onslaught of bullshit they'll have to deal with once they die. As we're going to cover, the afterlife in Egyptian mythology is insanely dangerous when compared to other beliefs, and if you just try raw dogging it with no help or preparation, you're going to get eaten by 600 crocodiles before you can even open your eyes. So you have to be rich. And by rich, I mean like tomb rich. That means financiers, landowners, advisors, any other mid to high tier nobility. When you look at Egyptian tombs, you'll often see tons of writing both on the walls and on the sarcophagus itself. These inscriptions are part of an amalgam of guide texts called the Book of the Dead. The primary form this book takes, however, is as papyrus scrolls buried with the body, although sometimes the wrappings themselves used in mummification are incorporated into this overarching book. This really just depended on the time period, embalmer, and the wishes of the deceased or their family. This text is a series of spells useful for the deceased to navigate the troubles they're destined for in the afterlife. In this context, the term spell could mean a lot of things. Sometimes it's a prayer, but oftentimes it could just be plain instruction. Sometimes it'd be a literal spell as we'd think of them today, giving the user the ability to turn into an animal or magically ward off dangers. So okay, you're dead, and in Egypt. And it's 1400 BC, and you're loaded. What happens now? Well, during your funeral, there will be certain prayers and rituals performed to awaken your consciousness in the afterlife. The specifics of these rituals vary a lot, depending on what time period you're looking at. While the general content of the Book of the Dead stayed pretty consistent for a while, the book itself started getting major revisions and abbreviations starting in the late Ptolemaic era. Many of these shortened segments would be incorporated into different aspects of the funerary process. Some would be broken off into their own texts focusing on illustration instead of direct instruction, and others would be ritualized and added as a part of the rites surrounding entombment. But none of that matters if you're dead. The first step for you, after your spirit awakens in the afterlife, is to start returning your bodily functions to yourself. The Ka is a twin spirit to your living soul who exists as a sort of cosmic duplicate of you, waiting to wake up until you enter the world of the dead and begin to attempt to claim powers of near godhood. Until this power is reclaimed by your Ka, though, you aren't going to get very far. This is a slow process where your spirit mentally recites these spells to your Ka, such as Spell 22, giving the mouth of a man to him in the necropolis, and Spell 25, spell for causing the deceased to remember his name. This is an important step for the deceased, as they only have a short window in which they're able to accomplish this. Many of the early spells in the book are related to this process. I also want to call some attention to the importance of remembering your name. Names in the Egyptian afterlife have a lot of power. One of the spells later on involves speaking the name of various gods to either dodge their wrath or gain some of their power by tricking some of these cosmic entities into believing you are that god. There are several religions where names are very important. One that comes to mind is Christian and Jewish demonology, where the idea of knowing a demon's true name, or in other regards, even knowing an angel's true name, can give you great power over these entities. Once you have your body back, though, next up is affirmations. Your Ka may be freaking out right now because they may or may not be aware of who they are. They're confused and need to be reassured that they've lived a good life and haven't faced oblivion just yet. This is where the first of a few negative confession spells come in. In particular, spell 105, which is unfortunately untitled. The negative confession is a series of statements certifying that the confessor did no wrong and has not committed any crimes. After these affirmations, it's time to get some tools under your belt before you can start tackling some of the challenges ahead of you. Just so we're not out here all day, here's a sampling of some of my favorites. Spell 10, allowing the deceased to go forth against his enemies. Spell 88, making the forms of a crocodile. Spell 44, spell for not dying again. Spell 43, spell for not letting the head of the deceased be cut off from him in the necropolis. Spell 31, spell for driving back a crocodile that comes to seize the magic of the deceased. Spell 35, spell for the deceased not being eaten by snakes in the necropolis. Once you have a good handle on your new magic powers and you can use them to fight against the fearsome critters in the netherworld, it's time to make the big step. You see, being a Ka is cool and all, but you're a pretty huge guy, and you are destined for way more than that. If you're looking to reach the end of this tough road, it won't be enough for you. Using spells 96 and 97, one can begin the process of transforming your spirit from a lowly Ka to a mighty Ak. An Ak is a divine spirit with natural dominion over the afterlife. It was believed that since the god Osiris and the other gods were all Aks, one could only confront them after this transformation. Additionally, once in this form, one has the ability to traverse the hazards of the necropolis, allowing them to enter into the kingdom of Osiris. I know we haven't talked about him yet, but just hold on to the name Osiris. We'll come back to him in a little bit. After a successful transformation, you're ready to start claiming your spot as a god in the afterlife. The first hazard you'll face on this journey is the Ring of Fire. To get to Osiris' kingdom, you'll need to hitch a ride on Ra's boat, better known by its street name, the Sun, and sail down the Solar River. This ride brings you through the solar system up to the realm of Osiris. Now I know what you might be thinking. Colin, this is pretty similar to Charon's whole deal, right? Like, that's a pretty big coincidence. Yup. The Ring of Fire itself isn't super well defined, insofar as we don't super know what it is, but spell 136, spell for sailing in the great sacred boat of Ra to pass by the Ring of Fire, gives us passage onto Ra's boat and grants the user protection against whatever this hazard is. The book tends to leave out a lot of specifics when it comes to the individual hazards you may come across, and instead focuses solely on the things you need to do and say. There could be a couple reasons for this. My main theory is that these concepts would have been taught well ahead of time to the individual while they were still alive, so there was no need to explain what these things were in detail in the book itself. Since writing was a luxury and stone carving took time, they probably left out about as much as they could. It's not unreasonable to think that the scribes just wanted to trim as much of the fat from this thing as possible. When you're on your 111th spell that you have to write by hand, maybe you're going to gloss over some of the flowery descriptions. But regardless, after the Ring of Fire, the deceased must then pass by a series of mounds owned by the gods. Following the instructions of spell 149 and the handy maps included as part of spell 150, the deceased will know which mounts to pass by or enter, their names, and how to address them properly. Failure to do this will risk the wrath of the gods and the other inhabitants of these mounds. I want to remind you all of the stakes here again. These are some Indiana Jones-ass challenges that the departed will have to pass through to continue on their path. Not only is safety not guaranteed, but the obliteration of your soul is more or less guaranteed unless you have this book and a good amount of luck on top. This book is absolutely vital for anyone going through the process, and you likely wouldn't even open your eyes without it. Once you're past the mounds and the ring of fire, the deceased comes upon the Hall of Two Truths and the tribunal of 42 judges. I don't know why they didn't call it the Hall of 42 Truths, but I didn't write the book. Here they must make another negative confession, a long proclamation serving as an affidavit for your life, declaring loudly and openly that you have committed no crimes. This is the book report of all book reports, and the future existence of your soul and the prosperity of your descendants is on the line here. You can try to lie and bluff it. The book even hints that such a strategy may work at this phase, but the ultimate test is up next, and no number of tall tales will save you from it. After your confession, the 42 judges representing the 42 regions in Egypt at the time will hear your confession and pass you along for judgment. It is here that we see our familiar scene with the scale and the feather, a symbol for Maat, the goddess representing truth and knowledge. The idea is that your heart is the center of your being. Every decision and action in your life was held in your heart to be evaluated in this final judgment. When weighted against the feather of Maat, it could be found heavier, indicating a life of wrongdoing, or balanced, indicating a virtuous life. If declared unworthy of the afterlife, the deceased's heart is fed to a creature, Yama, who devours the hearts of the unvirtuous. From there, we don't really know what happens to you. There are mentions throughout the text of the blessed being a separate class from the damned, but it's unclear if those not declared worthy continue on after a negative judgment, or if they're just destroyed outright. With how much emphasis is put on the heart in these spells and in the general burial artwork, it's hard to imagine how one would attempt to live in this world without it, but there's no confirmation either way. But if the gods judge you righteous, though, you are granted access to the kingdom of Osiris and are elevated to the seat of the gods, finally putting an end to your long, perilous journey through the netherworld. So, did you guys notice anything in that last section? Something interesting that wasn't mentioned, literally even once? That's right. What the fuck does Anubis have to do with literally any of that? Like, I'm not crazy, right? In all the texts I've read regarding this post-death journey, Anubis is really only encountered in the Hall of Two Truths sometimes. He's mentioned and prayed to a lot in the rites surrounding the burial and entombment, but in the afterlife, he's very rarely seen. Many sources will say that he's the one presiding over this trial of Maat, but it seems to be a little bit more ambiguous than that. There wasn't a centralized body that scribed and sent these out, so most local embalmers and priests would create their own, referring back to their education regarding the mythology of the afterlife. Because of this, you'll see variations in certain details that could come down to the area, time it was created, personal beliefs of the deceased or their family, or even the personal beliefs of the scribe themselves. Digging deeper into that, the time period specifically matters a lot when looking at Anubis. See, Anubis was one of the earliest gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and he was more or less the only god referred to in death rituals starting as early as the pre-dynastic period. However, starting in the early kingdom period, worship of Osiris as a sort of tentpole deity gained popularity, and he started taking over a lot of jobs previously held by the other gods historically. This shift towards a sort of casual monotheism meant that around the Middle Kingdom period, up through the Roman takeover of the region, you'll find many accounts where Osiris is personally overseeing the final judgment, while Anubis is merely there on the sidelines, or even omitted completely. This continues through the end of the Roman period, where these beliefs slowly died out and were replaced by other Mediterranean traditions. So, Anubis may not have always been the de facto psychopomp for Egypt, but he was still in charge at first though, right? Well, yes, that's true, but remember what we're looking for here. We're not looking for gods of the underworld or gods of death. We want guides to the afterlife, and I'm not sure we really found any here. Every step of the way here, these gods are trying to scam you, kill you, trick you, or feed your heart to whatever an amut is. Not a single one will help you if you don't know what to do. That might make you think that the Egyptians just don't have a psychopomp, but I'd argue that they do. Not only that, I think they have one of the most helpful psychopomps we'll look at today. We'll see this in later examples, but one thing I really had to open my mind to in looking into this was that a psychopomp can be a lot of things. Going into this, I had a pretty firm idea of the psychopomp being the Reaper, a guy who walks you down the tunnel. Now though, after reading through so much history and understanding how complex these beliefs are, I think the fucking book is Egypt's psychopomp. I get that it's not a god or any sort of spiritual deity, but this book serves every function that a spiritual guide would serve. It's helpful, detailed, serves its purpose when needed, and can be discarded once ascension to the final resting place is achieved. It's also like literally a guide. It's comparable to an incredibly detailed map for the world's shittiest theme park. Thematically though, what are we looking at here? Well, it's tough to analyze the implications that come with the personification of death when the object of ideation is literally just a book and not a person. But I'm going to try to anyway. I think the interesting part of this tradition is how we can look at the people of Egypt and how they prepared each other for this passage. Like the Greeks, success in the afterlife has a fair bit to do with your material wealth in life. While the Greeks used that wealth as a literal payment to Charon to row them down the river, the Egyptians seem to focus more on spending that wealth to properly set the deceased up for the things they need in the afterlife. You'll see lavish tombs and grave goods that the dead will hopefully bring with them on the other side, but the cost of these pales in comparison to the cost needed to build these structures in the first place. While not every rich guy got a whole-ass pyramid, some of the tombs we've uncovered are massive. And while we can ignore costs like labor, the materials themselves, as well as the specialized tools needed to carve the required spells, would have a huge cost implication. And where I found that the actual belief in Charon as a real god may or may not have been what we think of it as today, it seems pretty concrete that the folks back in Egypt truly held these beliefs as sacred and would have put considerable stock into achieving a proper burial. A powerful family's patriarch, should they have the opportunity, would be planning the specifics of his death and burial well ahead of time, and his family would all have large input and incentive in realizing these wishes. In Egyptian mythology, ancestor worship plays a major role in one's everyday life. The descendants of a powerful person would prepare well for their ascension with the hopes that they could one day be worshipped as a god, like some of the mightiest pharaohs were. Many religions are focused solely on the preparation of the soul as a ticket into heaven, but Egyptians felt that piety was only half the preparation you needed. Your family and your loved ones want the best for you and know how tough the road ahead is, so they wrote down the hard parts for you in case you forget. One more little gift for them to grab on your way out the door. And I think that's probably as cleanly as someone could transition to the next one. I'm not really sure how to start talking about Yama. Hinduism is a lot of things. It's one of the largest religions in the world with 1.2 billion followers. In terms of its age, it's indisputably ancient. While the previous two examples were also incredibly old, well, to put it in perspective, Hinduism came a little bit before both of the other examples, and has been widely practiced all the way up until today. That's literally thousands of years at least, potentially tens of thousands or more depending on who you ask. We're getting ahead of ourselves though. Let me explain some terms for those unfamiliar with Hinduism and the history of India. This is India, the massive subcontinent hanging off the bottom of Asia. In terms of early starters in the civilization race, Indians were some of the first and sometimes among the most well recorded, even rivaling China's impeccable historiographical streak. While the folks of the Saraswati River area were first to significantly develop in India, and potentially anywhere, we're going to look a bit further forward to around 1200 BC, at the start of what we would call the Vedic Age. The 10 Vedas are the foundational texts for Hinduism. They recorded on paper the largely oral tradition from the people living in the greater Indus region, including what we would consider modern-day Pakistan and Iran. These books were written and recorded over the course of hundreds of years until the definitive versions of the Rig Veda were compiled into one compendium containing the full 10 books. The last of the Vedic texts, the Atharva Veda, was written around 700 BC, and it marked the end of what is considered the Vedic period. Now, all of that so far has been true based on pretty easy to verify and understand facts. The rest of this, though, well, I'm gonna need a pretty hefty disclaimer here. A lot of the other belief systems that I've discussed so far were relatively simple for me to learn and convey the details of. This is helped by my own personal experience with these belief systems and general cultural osmosis. Hinduism is different. It's an incredibly complicated religion, and even trying to narrow it down under the term religion isn't even necessarily accurate either. Hinduism is a lot of things to a lot of people. It's the primary religion of one of the most populous countries in the world and is based on some of the oldest written texts we have ever discovered. On top of this, I have very little frame of reference for the subtleties of Hinduism, as well as the general culture of the region. While this is true for the other religions I'm discussing too, I feel like this is the one where I'm most likely to get it wrong. I spent some time deliberating whether or not this concern was major enough to just skip this section altogether and maybe just add a quick note about it or something at the end. However, during my research, the information I came across was so interesting and cool and weird that I felt that it was worth sharing anyway, even if I might get some of the specific details wrong. The Vedas and their supplemental texts take years of study under a guru to properly understand. It's not the sort of thing you can just dive into, grab some excerpts from to throw in your YouTube video and call it a day. They're incredibly symbolic hymns and prayers that require a lifetime of pondering and external context to fully get the meaning of. This wasn't as true for some of the other religions we've talked about for a few reasons. One could be that the prescriptive nature of Hinduism is at odds with the casual colonialism of the Greek Empire. But I believe the biggest reason is due to the relative ages of these other beliefs. Early forms of Hinduism based around the teaching of the Vedas are thousands of years old and have been regularly practiced for the entire period between then and now by a massive number of people across a wide geographical region. There's not only metaphor that I'm missing context for, but also a millennia of years worth of history. One thing I learned quickly when starting my research process for this topic was that theology in Hinduism is incredibly different than what I'm used to. While I normally wouldn't go into this sort of thing, I think it's important to be upfront with where I'm coming from here just as a starting point. I was raised from a young age as Roman Catholic. Growing up, Catholicism played a major role in my life, from church groups to the schools I went to and the inferiority complex I developed for adulthood. In my primary school, these classes covered everything from normal Bible-centric study and commentary to sacrament preparation and religious-based history. In high school, my classes spread out to more general things like media analysis, ethics, and world religions. In fact, the two classes I took in my senior year were world religions and the banality of evil, which is only really funny if you've seen my previous video. I bring this up exclusively to say that I have had a lot of religious education in my life. While I would not describe myself as a practicing Catholic these days, I've spent a lot of time researching, pondering, and discussing religion both in school and through church programs with my priest growing up. While I haven't maintained my religious faith towards Christianity in my adult years, I have still maintained my interest in the area of religion from an academic perspective. Obviously. Because of this education, I have a very specific idea of how religion, works, you know? The practical execution of Christianity is essentially reading and following the instructions given to you in the Bible. Every aspect of the religion and its practices is outlined in some way through this singular, monolithic compendium. Hinduism, as I understand it, is very different. While the Vedas and Upanishads are incredibly important and are studied at the deepest level by priests and yogis and gurus, they don't play the same role as many other primary religious texts. It has been explained to me that the practice and study of Hinduism often has little to do with actually reading and referring to the texts themselves outside of ceremonial practices and direct recitation of the hymns. The focus of Hindu worship has more to do with prayer, meditation, and direct teaching from religious leaders, referring to those texts as supplemental material for your own meditation and guidance. I say this because my examples I will bring up here are all dependent on analyzing the differences between the portrayal of the god Yama between the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, and the Zoroastrian Avesta, an Iranian religion contemporary to the authorship of the Vedas, which has maintained regular worship to the modern era in India and Iran. Fun fact, Iran is a different spelling of the country Iraq. I will be referring to these excerpts out of context and not in the format they were originally intended for. While I think this is acceptable in an academic sense to track the changes in attitude towards death in these texts, I don't want to mislead you into thinking that these are the direct beliefs of Hindus as a whole. So, with all that said, I want to revisit my brief description of Yama from the Rig Veda with this context in mind. I haven't looked into pronunciation for any of these names. I'll put a caption saying that. Colin, put a caption saying that. In the Rig Veda, Yama is said to be the son of Surya, one of the 8 solar deities, and his wife Sanjana. He was born with his twin sister Yami, and he was the first mortal being to die. Upon his death, he paved the way to the afterlife, claiming the kingdom of the afterlife and taking his place as a god. During funeral rites, prayers to Yama are said to ask for him to come down and guide the deceased to his kingdom. This prayer puts focus on the celebration and honor of ancestors and forefathers, as the deceased would join them in celebration in the afterlife. Yama is also sometimes said to be escorted by 2 dogs who also play an important role in the specific process of guidance to the afterlife. These dogs, Shyama and Sabala, are 4-eyed hounds that act as earthly messengers of Yama. They are the children of Sarama, the famous dog belonging to the god Indra. When the deceased's soul is not greeted by Yama himself, these hounds act in his place and are described as either kind navigators that will guide souls to Yama's kingdom, or as vicious, snarling creatures to avoid. This passage from the Rig Veda in particular is very interesting concerning the dogs. The 2 dark messengers of Yama, with flaring nostrils, wander among men, thirsting for the breath of life. Let them give back to us a life of happiness here and today, so that we may see the sun. It's suggesting here that the dogs serve the purpose of not only guiding the souls to Yama, but also to devour the sadness of the mournful. The hounds give their life back with happiness and levity. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Colin, this is pretty similar to Cerberus, this whole deal, right? That's a pretty big coincidence. Yup. There are several other stories in the Vedas concerning Yama and his sister Yami, but they aren't incredibly relevant, may not actually be about the same Yama, and could also get this video age restricted. This retelling of the story of Yama is not only consistent within all the books of the Vedas, but also in Zoroastrian mythology. Their version of Yama, named Yima, confusingly, is the first man who turned down the mandate of heaven to be the world's first great king. Through his virtuousness, his kingdom was a paradise on earth. Interestingly, there are also some noteworthy aspects that link the Hindu Yama to the Norse god Ymir. Aside from their name similarities, they also share similar mythological origins. the Hindu Yama and the Iranian Yama each being the first man, and the Norse Ymir being the first living creature and creator of the giants. There are a lot of reasons you could speculate for how this happened, but I think the simple answer is a ton of people were moving through the region at the time, and people talked to each other. Looking outside the Vedas and Avesta, though, we see Yama continue to be an important figure in later Hindu texts. After the Vedic period, several other books were written to expound upon the foundation laid in the Vedas. There are too many types of books to list here, and even more types of books, so we're just going to talk about a collection called the Puranas. The Puranas are a collection of stories that act as retellings, commentaries, and expansions on the ideas presented in the Vedas and Upanishads. Our example passages are coming from the Garuda Purana, which focuses on the ritual and philosophical aspects of death and the afterlife. In this Purana, Yama and his messengers are described in great detail. His description, though, is incredibly different than what we see in the Vedas. For simplicity, I'm going to read a few translated passages from the Rig Veda, followed by those from the Purana. From the Rig Veda, we see, Yama was the first to find the way for us, this pasture that shall not be taken away. Where our ancient fathers passed beyond, there everyone who is born follows, each on his own path. Go forth to those ancient paths on which our ancient fathers passed beyond. There you shall see the two kings, Yama and Varuna, rejoicing in the sacrificial drink. Unite with the fathers, with Yama, with the rewards of your sacrifices and good deeds in the highest heaven, leaving behind all imperfections. Go back home again, merge with a glorious body. And in the Garuda Purana, we get, then 2 terrifying messengers of Yama are come, of fierce aspect, bearing nooses and rods, naked with grinding teeth as black as crows, with hair erect, with ugly faces, with nails like weapons, seeing whom his heart palpitates, and he releases excrement. Having put round him a body of torment, and bound the noose about his neck, they forcibly lead him a long way, like the king's officers a convict. Very sinful people behold the terrifying form of Yama, huge of body, rod in hand, seated on a buffalo, roaring like a cloud at the time of Pralaya, like a mountain of lampback, terrible with weapons gleaming like lightning, possessing 32 arms, extending 3 yojanas, with eyes like wells, with mouth gaping, with formidable fangs, with red eyes and a long nose. Even Chitragupta is fearful, attended by death, fever, and others. Near to him are all the messengers, resembling Yama, roaring. Now, after hearing all that, you're obviously thinking to yourself, who the fuck is Chitragupta? But seriously, that's a pretty wild discrepancy between the books. What's going on here? Well, the answer isn't really that simple. Like I said, there are a lot of books written in very different times from each other. These Puranas are all largely attributed to a sole author, but much like Pausanias' poems were compiled from stories told orally, often reciting different Vedic stories. These tales came from all over the place, and there's not any real specific place we can point to for why they're like that. There's a Hindu term that I have found very helpful called kalpa bed. According to Hindu tradition, the universe is, as is everything, cyclical. A kalpa is one rotation of this cycle where the universe is created, observed, and destroyed. One kalpa in Hinduism can be approximated to 4.23 billion years. The idea behind kalpa bed is that discrepancies between the texts are not contradictions of each other, but instead are recollections from different kalpas. It's believed that the most wise and learned scholars of Hinduism who compile these Puranas are able to see these stories across time in different kalpas. In chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, there is a scene where Arjuna is shown the many avatars of Vishnu. While he sees the many avatars he's familiar with from the stories he knows, he's unfamiliar with some of them as they are yet to be in this kalpa. This principle is pivotal to the heavy themes of cycles in Hinduism and provides a clear explanation to how many things could be true at once. Okay, but for real, who is this guy? Fine, Chitragupta's Yama's accountant, I think. I'm not finding a lot of citable information on him outside of the segments from the Puranas and Vedas that I read, but I'm pretty sure he's the god of writing and knowledge. He keeps account of all the names of those who are taken into Yama's kingdom and what their final judgments are. He's never referenced by name in the Vedas, but they allude to his, vibe without naming him directly. He's pretty cool, seems laid back, and has next to nothing to do with our current topic. Taking another step back to the literal side of things, there's not a lot for us to go on here when it comes to our thesis, at least not much that I could find. Again, while we know roughly when these were written and by whom, we don't know how old these stories are and where exactly they came from. Any guesses I make here towards causes for the shift would be pure speculation, which I'm not comfortable engaging in with this topic. The Sanskrit word Purana literally translates to old or ancient, and the common understanding is that their authorship comes from a much wider area than the Vedas did when they were first recorded. There's about 1,000 years of history we're missing out on here, and unfortunately I can't give you as satisfying of an answer here as we did with Charon or Anubis. So I guess to leave you with something, I'll say that the Vedic depiction of Yama is a pretty good example of a psychopomp, and believe it or not, the only one so far I would really consider a straightforward example. He's a guy who has very clear origins, who actually guides people to the afterlife, and is seemingly positively or neutrally viewed for doing this job. Even his dogs, who are described as dark, fearsome creatures, do a service for the people of either guiding departing souls in Yama's place or consuming the sadness of those left behind. That is, if you're only reading the Vedas. The Puranic Yama isn't really a psychopomp, as the stories of him often revolve around his servants or heralds fetching souls for him. While the Vedas clearly describe Shivana and Shyama as dogs, the stories about their mother, Sarama, aren't as clear. In fact, some say that a similar shift in interpretation happened with Sarama, as did Yama. In this paper, the author Alessia Manca argues that much of this change could have come from the shifting view of dogs in Indian culture and how proximity to them was indicative of your social class. Dogs went from being important for success and survival in a largely agrarian civilization, protecting livestock and their owners from predators and thieves, to dirty creatures with spiritually sinister motives. One reason she gives for this shift has to do with the tightening strictness around sexual promiscuity in the regions, and dogs' looseness around promiscuity. They had been seen as an unclean and unholy creature, and the stories of Sarama took on a more sinister tone. More so, when you look at the story we read from the Garuda Purana, we can see how the messengers of Yama have taken a fully devilish and nefarious form, as opposed to their role in the Vedas, which was far more nuanced. With absolutely no evidence to back up my position, I'd say that this is probably similar to what happened with Yama. As culture develops and priorities shift, religious beliefs tend to shift as well. The Vedas often told stories with very practical foundations and true-to-life allegories. I believe it's wholly possible that the story of Yama shifted to being more sinister for the same reasons we saw them shift during the plague. There's nothing in the Christian Bible that tells people they should fear death as a spooky skeleton, but the messaging from both religious and secular sources agreed that he was indeed a spooky guy, as he became a sort of inverse mascot for the disease. There's a world where Yama's transformation into his devilish persona over this 1,000-year gap was a similar voyage. Priorities change over time, and these characters we prop up have adapting utilities as these shifts happen. In which case, we have to sort of ask ourselves, why do we keep making psychopomps in the first place? My initial plan for this section was to begin talking to you about the modern examples of psychopomps from pop culture. In fact, that was supposed to be the focus of the conversation here, with the historical examples as a quick context filler. But now, I think I have to take a different approach. We've just spent a long time looking at our ancient examples and the wildly different ways they present these figures and their utility. In modern media, though, well, they're all kind of telling the same story. This makes sense when you think about it. Although written in similar time periods, the Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and the Greek beliefs couldn't be more different from each other, despite the closeness in distance and time. As for those who in Hinduism, the distance between the Mediterranean and India basically meant that they were on different planets spiritually. Nowadays, though, all the examples I'm going to use are from the last 10 years or so in a post-internet world where distance is no longer a factor when it comes to spreading culture. So instead of giving each example the spotlight, I'm going to give you a quick glimpse into each one, and we'll circle back and discuss their themes as a whole. Starting off, Before Your Eyes is a 2021 Indie Darling and BAFTA Award recipient developed by Goodbye World Games and published by Skybound. In the game, you play as a protagonist retelling your life story to a spiritual guide as you sail down the ethereal river. To get into the city of our nebulous deity named the Gatekeeper, your surly coyote Psychopomp has to pitch your life as a statement of value. But he can only sell you as well as he knows you, so he dives into your memories to get a better look. The main mechanic or gimmick this game is based around is the use of computer vision via your webcam to detect eye movement. Each scene is presented as a flashback to a certain point in time where your life is spelled out through key moments. These flashbacks will continue on for as long as you can keep your eyes open. The second you blink, however, the scene skips ahead. This skip could be seconds, hours, or even years. Outside of the main mechanic, which they actually executed a lot better than you'd think they would, the star of the show for me is, in fact, your Psychopomp. Obviously. When you first meet him, his gruff exterior is played for comedic effect. As you continue on in the game, though, his attitude shifts in different ways. I want to stop for a second and give one more spoiler warning before continue. I won't do this for our other topics, but I think this was one that flew under the radar for enough people to deserve one more warning. This game has a very specific story to tell, and by retelling it here, I'm kind of going to ruin it in the worst way possible. It's cheap, and it only takes about 90 minutes to get through. If what I've presented so far seems interesting at all, please pause this and come back after playing it. Towards the end of the game, as your story ends, after retelling a great life, your coyote guide confronts you for spinning a tall tale. Growing angry, he forces you to start again and retell the story honestly. So your story starts again, and key pieces of information are clarified that were presented falsely the first time. In your original story, you were a child prodigy pianist who cracked under the intense pressure from your mother and went on to be a world-famous painter. This is only half true. In reality, you were indeed the promising star child virtuoso, but then you got sick. As your story unfolds, your guide's tone changes as he realizes he isn't talking to a braggadocious artist, but rather is talking to an 11-year-old kid. He takes a kinder, more patient, and comforting approach as you retell the last few days of your life. The rest of your story continues as you would imagine. Your obsession with accomplishments and lifetime achievement was all a massive cope for the reality of dying so young. Throughout your story, you put so much importance on making a name for yourself and achieving something. When I first played the game, I thought this was a very immature point of view, but once the main character's age was revealed, it made a lot more sense. I remember as a kid being so concerned with the idea of legacy. I was terrified of becoming a normal person and that the ghost of my memory would die shortly after I did. The character you play in this game felt like a failure for never having the chance to tell a good story without realizing he already had. When the two of you approach the Gatekeeper, instead of presenting your story himself, the last scene plays out like this.
You know, for a while now, I've wondered if I'm just not a good enough storyteller. If I just don't have grand enough words, can't tell grand enough stories. But grand words and stories, I think they may be overrated. I know just what to tell her. Watch for her now. I've seen the Gatekeeper take many forms depending on the soul I bring her. But once you see her, you'll know. Believe me. I should go get ready. Don't worry. We got this. I think. There she is. Wish me luck.
Gatekeeper, before you sits the soul of a child who died before he could grow old.
That means she's ready to hear your story.
You know, I never told you how much I loved your story. It's really so imaginative, and the person you wrote about is such an interesting and intense guy. My only issue was, well, I didn't like him very much. So, I wanted to read you something I wrote for you, which is about the Benny I've known for 11 years now. It's called The Great Life of Benjamin Bryn. His mother was a composer, or at least that's what she dreamed she'd be. So, when her own dreams didn't pan out, she began to dream for him. But then, when he was just 11 years old, he got sick and was forced to stay inside for an entire year. And in that year, he began to worry that he hadn't lived enough. So he made up a story of the great life he thought he wanted to live, which only made him forget the great life he already had. How he had filled a new home with light and joy and promise. How he met a girl, his neighbor, who felt all alone in the world and made her feel okay again. And how, even when he was sick, he still gave his parents hope. How he reminded them exactly who they were after they had almost forgotten. So when he knew he was going to go, he was okay. Because he'd already lived a great life, a full life. And he was everything he needed to be, just as he was.
Close your eyes now, and keep them closed. She's gonna let you in. Go on. You know what to do.
Why is he smiling like that?
It must be somewhere that he likes.
This coyote is the fundamental image of a psychopomp in my head. What I'm about to say is mostly headcanon and isn't supported by the actual text itself that much. But I believe that this was his intention all along and that there is no gatekeeper. Looking at the story as a whole, what are we even really doing here? Like, yeah, on the surface, we're trying to give the best story of our life to the gatekeeper, but we're also coming to terms with the difficult moments in our own history. In my opinion, unlike most stories of gatekeepers like Cerberus, Anubis, or Osiris, or even St. Peter, where the judgment is made on a basis of morality and righteousness, our gatekeeper is working on ghost logic. This version of the afterlife isn't only for the biggest and greatest, and this interim space isn't just a prep room for some two truths trial by vibes. What we're seeing here is death helping us cope with our own demise. Our second retelling of the story, while sad, gives more clarity to the moments at the end of our life and allows us to view our impact on those who loved us in context. For the living among us, we'll see these moments as passing incidents with huge spans of time between them. For many of us, we're too caught up with our own lives to even really notice when they happen, and for those at the end of our lives dealing with a deadly disease, it might even be hard to recognize them in the moment. I don't think our story in Before Your Eyes is unique to this character. I think if we were in his position, we'd see the same scene played out. If you could see lined up, back to back, all the moments where you made the lives of those around you better, Well, I think you'd get in. But we have to stop talking there. Even if you ignored my warning earlier, you should still go play it if you haven't. I didn't spoil the entirety of the story, and it still hits even if you know the reveal. I promised that we weren't going to analyze each one of these in detail, and I'm already over 1,000 words deep on this one. No, instead, we're going to keep this one in mind while we look at our next example. In the Witcher series, Geralt of Rivia is faced with death at every turn. As a Witcher, he is constantly at odds with ghoulish monsters as well as al-ghoulish people who do nothing but stand in the way on his quest to be with the ones he loves. The second book in the series, The Sword of Destiny, is the last in a duology of short stories. It leads directly into the start of a 5-book series in which Geralt and friends track down his adoptive daughter Ciri and his elusive love Yennefer of Vengerberg. Our example here has little to do with that, though. At the end of this book, Geralt is gravely injured and is being transported by a Good Samaritan to their home in the town of Sodden, the site of a devastating battle. Hearing where they are, Geralt leaps out of the wagon to visit the memorial at the top of a nearby hill. Having heard that many mages fell in the battle, he fears that Yennefer was among the names of the dead in that battle. As he kneels down in front of the stone memorial, he slowly reads off the names of the fallen: Laudbor of Muravel, Lida Ned, dear friends from his days on the road, Old Gorzad, Triss Marigold. He keeps reading. As he reaches the bottom, the last name is almost in his vision. Before he can read it, he's greeted by a soft voice. The two begin to speak.
Did you bring flowers?
She smiled and lowered her eyelashes. He felt a chill. She passed him without a word and knelt at the foot of the menhir, touching the stone with her hand.
I do not bring flowers,
She said, lifting her head.
but the ones lying here are for me.
He looked at her. She knelt so that she was concealing the last name engraved in the stone of the menhir before him.
Who are you?
He asked slowly. She smiled and emanated cold.
Don't you know?
Yes, I do. Yes, I think I do.
He was tranquil. He could not be anything else, not anymore.
I've always wondered what you look like, my lady.
You don't have to address me like that.
She answered softly.
We've known each other for years, after all.
We have.
He agreed.
They say you dog my footsteps.
I do. But you have never looked behind you. Until today. Today, you looked back for the first time.
He was silent. He had nothing to say. He was weary.
How will it happen?
He finally asked, cold and emotionless.
I'll take you by the hand.
She said, looking at him directly in the eyes.
I'll take you by the hand and lead you through the meadow, into the cold, wet fog.
And then? What is there beyond the fog?
Nothing.
She smiled.
There is nothing more.
You dogged my every footstep, but struck down others, those that I passed on my way. Why? So I would finally begin to be afraid. I'll tell you the truth. I was always afraid of you. Always. I never looked behind me out of fear, out of terror that I'd see you following me. I was always afraid. My life has passed in fear. I was afraid. Until today.
Until today.
Yes, until today. We're standing here face to face, but I don't feel any fear. You've taken everything from me. You've also taken the fear from me.
Then why are your eyes full of fear, Geralt of Rivia? Your hands are trembling. You are pale. Why? Do you fear the last name engraved on the obelisk so much? If you wish, I shall speak that name.
You don't have to. I know what it is. The 14th name engraved in the stone. No, I'm not afraid to speak it now.
Then speak it.
Yennefer. Yennefer of Vengerberg.
And the flowers are mine.
Let us be done with this. Take me by the hand.
She stood up and came closer, and he felt the coldness radiating from her, a sharp, penetrating cold.
Not today. One day, yes, but not today.
You have taken everything from me.
No, I do not take anything. I just take people by the hand, so that no one will be alone at that moment. Alone in the fog. We shall meet again, Geralt of Rivia. One day.
There's a theme to the examples I presented here. Looking at our psychopomps from history, we can tell a lot about the priorities of the people who wrote these myths. Our psychopomps are very practical in nature. They're here for our benefit, but they stay at arm's length. The goals of our ancestors in death were focused primarily on getting to the destination, on taking our place in the hereafter and joining our ancestors. The journey was long and hard, and the guides allotted to us were there to courier us as fragile packages, to keep us safe and on the right path so we could join the eternal feast on the other side. They cared about us, but they weren't exactly caring. When you compare our modern examples to the stories we read about Charon, Yama, and yes, even the fucking book, there's a stark difference in presentation and our attitude towards our guides. I'm definitely not qualified to make any definitive statements on what exactly has caused this change in attitude over the recent centuries. I don't think there's anyone alive qualified to make so bold a claim. From my perspective, though, I think it comes from our raised quality of life, increased secularization of our media, and the way our stories have changed over time. For the first point, most people alive today are not living in the conditions of pre-Vedic India or Middle Kingdom era Egypt. We have modern comforts with many securities we take for granted. We're not worried about crocodiles entering our homes and eating our children, or even worse, our livestock. And a bad thunderstorm doesn't mean the potential collapse of our entire community. When we think of safety and security in the current day, we're often looking for inner peace. We place mental health and happiness as a higher priority since our low-level Maslow needs are sort of met by default as a member of modern society. This implicit security can transition into how we portray reality in our stories. Navigation and safety on a long trip isn't something we worry about in the modern era, so while the logistics of traveling across 100 miles of sea are a major factor in Greek myth, a modern story wouldn't put that much thought into it. Our modern stories are largely character dramas, focused on introspection and the emotional impact of the wider plot on the characters. When reading ancient plays or religious parables, we often see the characters' actions as ways to affect the outcome of the plot. They do whatever makes sense to set up the moral the story is trying to teach the audience. As we progress through time, we start seeing a shift away from strict morality or historical retellings to dramas and comedies with rich characters and a focus on interpersonal conflict over a strict series of events. Reading the works of Shakespeare with a heavy focus on soliloquy and introspection, we see the beginnings of that shift into modern storytelling. I believe that this pattern our fiction took can be applied to our folklore as well. As we evolved the ways we tell stories, we became less focused on the destination and more on the inner world of those involved in this event. Specifically with the Reaper, we start seeing some signs of this shift in the 19th century. In a book of Irish broadside poems, we see a poem titled A Dialogue Between Death and the Sinner, in which we see a dialogue between death and... Okay, figure out, it's in the fucking title. This poem shows the rare point of view from death in this exchange. It's not quite as sympathetic as Meet Joe Black, but it's going to give us a good insight into the Reaper. We're not just seeing that he's reaping souls like we would from our medieval works, we're also seeing why he's taking them. We can see this poem making its way into early North American folklore as a slave song around the time of the American Civil War. As for why this shift towards heavy characterization took place, I believe at least part of it has to do with the reduced emphasis on religion as a muse for our art. While a lot of the greatest masterpieces we have from our history as humans comes from either a religious inspiration or via direct compensation from the local religious entity, we have generally seen religious dogma take a smaller and smaller place in people's day-to-day lives. I won't speculate here on why this happened or the measurable value of such a change, because I'm not your dad or your priest. If you do want to get preached to, I'm not the guy to do it. Stories where the characters could be more nuanced, where their decisions weren't evaluated as strictly good or bad, but instead on what their actions said about their personal morality. We could see villains not just as entities of vice and evil, but as perversions of logic or even the victims of a society that failed them. I will say that by moving away from basing art on interpretations of a morality framework, we were able to begin telling stories of any kind. Stories where characters could be more nuanced, where their decisions weren't evaluated as strictly good or bad, but instead on what their actions said about their personal morality. We could see villains not just as entities of vice and evil, but as perversions of logic or even the victims of a society that failed them. We could even start to look at the inner world of our greatest villain ever, the only one we know will come for each and every one of us. But why do we want to do that? Throughout history, we have always feared the Reaper. Death is the scariest thing we will ever do, and there's no way to prepare for the other side. The Reaper is our way as humans to give a grim face to this dark uncertainty. I've thought a lot about my own attitude towards death while writing the script for this video. I'm not 20 enough to think that I've fully come to terms with my mortality, but I'm also not 40 enough to think I have no clue whatsoever. Death is scary, you know? I think a lot of my academic interest in the subject comes from an attempt to, understand it more. I'm a pretty analytical person, and I think when I'm afraid of something, I'm quick to find an answer to why it's not scary. Even as a kid, I felt if there was a monster in the closet, I knew the way to make myself feel better was to get up and check. If it were in there, it'd just kill me either way, so I might as well do it on my terms. So when I look at the concept of dying as an adult, I want to gather as much data as I can on it. I'll read through medical research to see what is or isn't the new thing that will kill me this week. And I'll also look to see what people who came before me came up with when they did their own investigations into this. While I think I'm certainly at least a little weird with how much I think about it, I think that a lot of people would treat their fears this way. One of the greatest gifts we have as humans is an innate curiosity. When we think of the ancient question of what separates us from the beasts, the heavy hitter answers are always things like our ability to reason, our sense for language and patterns, and getting placed in a fertile river valley 300,000 years ago with abnormally few natural predators. For me, though, I think that curiosity and our desire to find the answers to things is the greatest gift we have. We saw the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave and decided to turn around. This immediate instinct to ask questions and find answers is how we started planting, how we went from digging with our hands to using tools, and how we explained the universe to ourselves when we had next to no data at our disposal. I want to sneak one more honorable mention of a psychopomp here at the very end. In the Buddhist tradition, there is considerable religious significance around the last days and hours of one's life. While in Buddhism, the afterlife is more of a transitionary state of existence and less of a destination, I still think they have a very unique example of the psychopomp role that's worth highlighting. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the specifics of the rituals surrounding one's death are described in great detail, starting with identifying the signs of death to funerary rites and burial traditions. Buddhism, much like Hinduism, with whom it shares its theological roots, famously places much significance on the cycle of death and rebirth. During one's journey through the process, they will transition between 3 intermediate states of reality, which are part of a larger collection of states called the bardo. The 3 stages in post-death bardo are the states of death, reality, and rebirth. Navigating these stages while dying is incredibly difficult as your mind begins to shut down and your body weakens. Ideally, one who is practiced in meditation should be able to maintain lucidity through these moments and may even be able to navigate these stages on their own. For most, though, help is needed to successfully navigate this process and prepare themselves for rebirth with as much lucidity and illumination as possible. This is done by the Great Liberation by Hearing, where the dying individual is coached by a religious teacher, preferably one whom the departing knew well in their life. If no teacher is available, a well-suited friend or family member may perform the ritual, which is preferred over not doing it at all. In this ritual, affirmations and instructions are recited aloud for the dying individual to hear. Once the body has died and the spirit has left it, the ritual will continue with the words spoken into the ear of the corpse for the spirit to hear via the last connection it has with its former body. In an ideal scenario, this ritual is performed with planning and ceremony and with the deceased's family and loved ones in the room praying along with the teacher. I love this example from Buddhism, as it's another case like with Egyptian mythology, where our psychopomp isn't a mythological creature, but something in the material world. In this case, our psychopomp in Buddhism is a friend who's still alive, someone we know personally, whom we can fully trust will get us to our next cycle of existence with no issue. And I think that's beautiful. We looked at the process of dying and the question of what happens next and decided we didn't want to leave it up to chance. We didn't want to trust some old guy with a boat or Chitragupta's #1 op, so we decided we had to do it ourselves. To close out here, I'm going to read you all a poem from John Neasley, published this year in the magazine Ecotone. There were many times during this project where I lost sight of what I was even trying to say with all of this. Even now, I'm not sure if I came close to it or not, or if I even know what I'm trying to say at this point. Through historical rabbit holes or insecurity about my ability to tackle such a crazy topic, or not knowing how to even begin presenting this information, I would find myself coming back to this poem over and over. In everything I read, this was the only piece I found that perfectly encapsulated why I think psychopomps are not only interesting, but extremely important for us as humans. In the shadow of a cedar tree that gave you sleep one summer when all responsibilities seemed to die, or so you dreamed, water lilies in a nearby pond, arms languishing at your side, fingers finding the slope of an anthill, resting on its impossible softness. When there, 3 ants in a cluster, returning home with the body of another. You knew from their slowness, heaviness, this way of carrying their dead patiently, letting them witness the earth once more before descending into dark. You wondered if there were a quiet room for them to gather, weigh the heart on a scale against the soul, if there were tunnels only the dead could travel. You doubted such a journey could occur alone. The grace of their antenna grazing your hand to avoid it, locating the safe path into the ground. Overhead, the sound of a jay at the top of a tree, each branch tranced in the wind. How easy to forget the feeling of wanting to be carried into some other life. Thank you for watching.
Can you hear me? Is there anyone there? Are you listening? I've never been so scared. What was I thinking? Did I think I'd be fine? That this was over, that everything was alright. As darkness gathers around me, as darkness gathers around me, someone carry